Trump is kind of the wet dream of American billionaires and the wealthy. Virtually everything Trump is doing is going to benefit the billionaires at the expense of ordinary Americans. If you think Elon Musk cares about middle class and working class Americans rather than padding his own bottom line, I have a big bridge from my hometown of Brooklyn that I want to sell you.
Hi, I'm Jo Crawford and welcome to Times Radio's Trump Report. Today I'm joined by Allan Lichtman, election forecaster and distinguished professor of history at the American University. Allan is known as the Nostradamus of US elections, and previously he predicted 9 of the past 10 US presidential votes, but last year he actually got it wrong. So I want to hear from Allan about what he makes of Trump's first 2 weeks in office, and how will this Trump victory influence the future of American politics? Allan, thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
My great pleasure.
You predicted that Trump would lose the election last year, and I first want to hear from you why you think your prediction went wrong, and what is it about Trump that led to his victory?
You know, I had predicted, I would say, 10 out of 10 elections before that, going all the way back to when I predicted Ronald Reagan's win in April 1982, almost 3 years ahead of time, when his approval rating was down in the dumps and Americans thought he was too old to run again. So this was really my first big loss. And I think it was a very unique election. I was, I think, the loudest voice saying the Democrats were making a huge mistake by publicly trashing their sitting president, their elected president, their elected nominee right out in public, and then pushing him out on the eve of the convention. We've never seen anything like this, and I do think that probably affected the prediction. The other thing we've never seen before was the degree of disinformation coming out in this election, headed by Elon Musk, who spent hundreds of millions of dollars on the election, and particularly focused on disinformation about the abortion issue, which should have been a huge issue for Harris. 2/3 of voters were pro-choice, a gap of about 35% between pro-choice and pro-life, but yet voters, in terms of who they thought would better handle the abortion issue, had it virtually tied. 49% Harris, 46% Trump. If it had been anything close to the gap between pro-life and pro-choice, Harris would have won going away. So, you know, I haven't finished, obviously, analyzing why I was wrong. I'm reassessing my keys. I got a lot of time. The next election is almost 4 years away. But those are two quick preliminary thoughts.
In terms of disinformation, I mean, there's reports of it being linked to Trump's first election that he was involved in. It's potentially been linked to Brexit, for example, other elections around the world, especially in terms of alleged Russian disinformation. Why is it specifically this time that you say that it's different? And you mentioned Elon Musk there. Why was that different that time?
Well, we've always had disinformation, but never to the degree that we've seen it this time. And it was centered on Musk. Musk is the richest man in the world. He is richer than the great majority of nations of the world. His net worth is greater than their gross domestic product. And we know he bought Twitter, X. He's got hundreds of millions of followers. His disinformation was viewed, according to reports, I don't track this myself, by at least 2 billion viewers. We have never seen anything close to that. Plus, we're seeing the abdication of the mainstream media because it's now being controlled by billionaires like Jeff Bezos and the fellow who owns the Los Angeles Times. They both killed editorials endorsing Harris. Other media outlets are controlled by big corporations, so we're no longer having the mainstream media as an effective check on disinformation or really telling truth to power. And that's the other half of the disinformation revolution. I'm not blaming the voters. Voters are not fact checkers. And throughout history, the big lie works. If you control the outlets of communication, you tell a lie loudly and often enough, and people come to believe it, believing that Trump and Harris were no different on abortion, for example. As I said, even if there had been anything approaching the real gap on that issue, Harris would have won going away.
And I guess there were other factors that potentially influenced people towards Trump. People were upset about inflation, for example, the spending of US foreign aid abroad for Ukraine and other places. But in terms of when you talk about that relationship between Trump and those tech billionaires, you recently said that it reminded you of that science fiction concept of certain elites becoming so rich that they gain control of society, the environment, the economy, and you said that that's a reality that's closer than you ever imagined it to be. Could you elaborate on that theory?
I'm almost 78. When I was a kid, I devoured lots of science fiction. And one of the themes of some of the science fiction that I read back then, many decades ago, was that a few individuals would become so wealthy and so powerful that they essentially controlled our society and our government. And my point was, maybe we're not quite there, but we are very, very close to being there. That these billionaires, 100 billionaires now, not just billionaires. I remember too the old TV show, The Beverly Hillbillies, in which this hillbilly discovered oil on his property, and the theme was, old Jed's become a millionaire, moving to Beverly Hills. Forget being a millionaire today. Forget being a billionaire. Today, it's the 100 billionaires that are exercising enormous control over our lives and our government. We're seeing it now with Elon Musk, who we elected to nothing, profoundly interfering with the operation of our government, even obtaining sensitive information for which he has no clearance on, government payments, which is incredibly personal information about anyone who gets any payments from government, including someone like myself. I don't work for government, but I'm old and I get Social Security and Medicare. So he now, I presume, has my private information, including my Social Security number as well. He wasn't elected to do any of that. I'm not a big fan of Bernie Sanders, but Bernie Sanders is right about one thing. There's a huge loophole in our tax system. We tax income, and we particularly tax the income of middle class and working class people because they have their taxes withheld from their paycheck. But we don't tax wealth. And that enables people like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos to obtain obscene amounts of wealth and then use it to control us.
I mean, on the other hand, how much of this is Trump actually getting this monopoly on social media platforms? We've seen Zuckerberg previously criticize Trump, but now he's actually been bending some of Meta's policies around fact-checking to be a more Trumpian, MAGA-friendly approach.
Yes, it's definitely a two-way mutual benefit relationship. It's symbiotic. Now, the biggest myth of American politics today is that Trump is a populist. That's abject nonsense. The populist movement that developed in the late 19th century is the exact opposite of what Trump represents. They were going after the rich people of their times. They were ordinary farmers and workers who believed they were being oppressed by the wealthy and the corporations. And they were advocating very progressive policies for their time. Expansion of the money supply, graduated income tax, not just control, but ownership of the big railroads and the communication companies. Just the opposite of what Trump advocates. Trump is kind of the wet dream of American billionaires and the wealthy. You know, what's he doing? He is proposing even more big taxes. And as he said in private during his first term to his buddies at Mar-a-Lago, I'm going to make you even richer with my big tax cuts. Then he's proposing big deregulation. So these big corporations and the billionaires will essentially be able to do anything they want without having to worry about government regulation with regard to anything, the environment, civil rights, worker safety. It's all going to be off the table. So and of course he is opening up new opportunities for extractive industries. So, virtually everything Trump is doing is going to benefit the billionaires at the expense of ordinary Americans. If you think Elon Musk cares about middle class and working class Americans rather than padding his own bottom line, I have a big bridge for my hometown of Brooklyn that I want to sell you.
I guess some might come back to that point and say, well, Trump still has that, he needs to have the favor of the American voter, the American people. If they see him doing these things to benefit these tech billionaires over the average American person, they could potentially lose his vote. He does have to have some dependency on them, surely.
This is all sustained and perpetuated by the disinformation, by the lies. And as I said, voters are not fact checkers. They're not political analysts. They're not economists. They're not necessarily going to be able to dig through the tremendous amount of disinformation, particularly when there is so little pushback from the mainstream media. So they're buying the disinformation that this all is to the benefit of themselves. Plus, there's a whole other side of the Trump appeal, and that's the culture war. His attack on diversity, equity, inclusion, his attack on transgender, his attack on LGBTQ persons, his attack on immigrants, on birthright citizenship. So all of this very much appeals to his xenophobic base, his homophobic base, and it's a tremendous flash and distraction from what he's doing economically. Remember what Trump said. On day one, I'm going to begin to bring down those grocery prices. And then, of course, well, maybe that's not going to happen. It's real hard to do, and maybe my economic policies are actually going to bring you some pain. So, he's very quickly pivoted from, I'm going to help you economically. I'm going to bring down those prices that you have been so complaining about and that you feel are so oppressive and was a critical reason why you voted for me. So forget that. Forget what I'm doing with my right hand. Look at what I'm doing with my left hand and going after all of those, transgenders and gays and immigrants that want to slit your throat. Watch that. And of course, the migrants that he's attacking, the undocumented immigrants, are the most law-abiding segment of our society. Every study shows they commit crimes at a rate well less than native-born Americans. And there's a reason for that. That's not random. They do not want to be caught up in the criminal justice system. And, one of the biggest lies perpetrated by Trump is that these undocumented immigrants are vicious criminals. It's just not true. The opposite is true.
And when we looked at that plane crash and his response that this was down to DEI initiatives, even though he even claimed himself that there wasn't any evidence to say that it was due to these DEI initiatives. When we look at that group of voters who voted for Trump because they just didn't like what Biden was doing, they didn't like what the Democrats were offering, and so Trump provided that alternative, and perhaps, they didn't agree with the Capitol riots on Jan 6th. How do you think that group of voters are currently receiving this Trump in his second presidency in these first 2 weeks?
The Democrats, as I pointed out, bear a lot of blame for what happened in 2024. I talked about their trashing their incumbent president right out in open, forcing him out right before the convention. So if the party itself, doesn't support its sitting president, why would voters do so? And I think, that was a new negative element. The other thing about the Democrats is they are horrific at messaging. And I emphasize horrific. They have yet to develop a simple, compelling message that appeals to the voters. The Republicans are light years ahead when it comes to messaging. Joe Biden had more domestic accomplishments than any American president since the 1960s. The stimulus bill, the CHIPS bill, the burn pits bill for disabled veterans, the tax and climate change bill, the infrastructure bill. But no one knows it. They think Biden did nothing because the Democrats were so horrible at messaging. And they're still struggling in the wake of Trump to achieve these messaging. Now, how have voters, reacted to what Trump has done in his first days? It pretty much reflects the polarization of our politics. According to the Gallup poll, which has traced early approval of newly elected presidents since Eisenhower in 1953, Trump has the lowest approval rating of any newly elected president, except Trump himself in 2017. He was at around 47%. The 538 average updated, which includes lots of polls that have only been around recently, still have him under 50%, pretty much reflecting the election where he got, I think, 49.5% of the popular vote. So he still seems to be holding his base, but he hasn't been able to expand that base at all. Plus, I would discount all of these early polls because we have never in the history of the country seen such an avalanche of radical moves solely initiated by the executive, not anything that really has gone through Congress. The attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is really a broad attack on minorities and women in this country. Even scrubbed references to minorities, tried to diminish a Martin Luther King Black History Month celebration. The attempt to abrogate birthright citizenship, which is right there in the Constitution. The spending freeze, the buyout of workers, the tariffs that are on, and then the tariffs that are off. Already court cases that have suspended the attempt to abolish birthright citizenship, and the freeze on federal spending. And of course, the general attack on workers, the firing of career employees in the Department of Justice simply because they investigated Donald Trump, the apparent firing or preparing to firing large numbers of the FBI agents who investigated Trump, and of course, while claiming he's going to have a new administration based solely on merit, he has appointed the least meritorious group of high officials in the modern history of the country. So I don't think the American people have been able to absorb all this. It's just been too much, too fast to really sink in. So I think we need some time, to make a better assessment of the public's response to the Trump administration.
I'm interested to hear your thoughts about Trump's lack of scripting, because we saw with that DI initiative claims, that was all unscripted from Trump. And it's interesting because the Associated Press, they said that the stenographers at the White House are actually really struggling to keep up with what Trump's saying because a lot of it is unscripted. And Biden, when he was in his first week, he spent around 2.5 hours talking on camera. But then Trump, on the other hand, this time round in his first week, he spent 7 hours, 40 minutes on camera. And then if we compare that with Trump's first week in his first presidency, he only spent 3 hours, 40 minutes on camera. This is a man who has publicly denounced journalists. He's called them the enemy of the people. He's threatened to revoke broadcasting licenses for some news channels. Why do we think that he is giving the media so much airtime this time round?
Yeah, the difference could not be more stark. Biden was very much of a controlled, button-up kind of presidency. As you say, little spontaneity. Most of it, his communications were carefully prepared. Not that he was incapable of it, but that was not his style. That was not the nature of his presidency. Trump is just the opposite. He loves to talk. He loves the media attention. He lives in part for that. That's been true not just of his political career, but really his whole life. After all, what made Trump a prominent public figure was his role on the phony reality show called The Apprentice, which he just loves. Plus, he loves talking off script. And it's worked for him. Look, he's been elected president twice. He has never been held accountable for anything he has said or done throughout his life, going all the way back to the early 1970s when the Department of Justice found his real estate company had been violating the Fair Housing Act by discriminating against black people in New York. Never held accountable for that, never held accountable for anything. So why not? Why not talk? Why not say whatever you want? Why not court as much media attention as you can and don't worry about what the critics might say? You know, Trump's address to the nation after the tragedy of the plane crash at Reagan National Airport was wildly criticized. You know, it was degrading, absurd. You know, instead of bringing us together and expressing compassion and empathy, he politicized the tragedy. He absurdly blamed diversity, equity, and inclusion, which every expert said had nothing whatsoever to do with the crash. He falsely said, you know, that he had greatly upgraded standards for air traffic controllers and Biden had downgraded them, read a script which had about disabled persons, which also had been on the website under Trump. It didn't matter. He didn't care. It doesn't matter. He will say whatever he wants to say. He will attack anyone he wants to attack. He doesn't care. Donald Trump has no shame. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand anything about Trump and his presidency.
How do you think that his communications team is feeling?
I think they're feeling that they're left in the dugout when the game is being played, that Trump plays the game the way he wants to play it, regardless of what his communications team might think. But let's not forget, his communications team is comprised of loyalists. It always have. So you're not going to get any kind of pushback. You know, look what we saw at the time he politicized the tragedy of the air crash. You know, J.D. Vance and other sycophants all got up and parroted, you know, Trump's lies about what actually happened in that crash. He's not going to get any pushback from anyone in his administration. You know, again, you know, he claims, you know, our administration is going to be based solely on merit, unlike the DEI administration of Joe Biden. You know, it's a pile of nonsense. He has appointed, as I said, the least meritorious on an independent analysis, leaving aside their politics, high officials in the history of the country. He has substituted, you know, traditional affirmative action for affirmative action for Trump loyalists. That is the number one criterion by which he makes his appointments.
I guess on the other hand, if we look at how Trump has been speaking on the international platform, for example, some suggest that actually the way that he has threatened to leave NATO, even though potentially he was never going to do that, those threats there have actually incentivized NATO allies to boost defense spending or consider boosting defense spending. And if we look at his recent threats to Mexico, for example, to apply tariffs there, We have seen that Mexico has responded by putting more soldiers towards the border, and actually potentially that language, that use of language that he has, is quite effective in getting what he wants.
That's a very good point. The United States is by far the most powerful nation in the world, rivaled maybe only by China, but China, it plays in a different realm, obviously. They don't have allies like we do, the same allies. So, yes, using the bullying tactics, the great power the United States has over, you know, much weaker countries like Canada or Mexico can work. And he did get some concessions with his bullying tariff tactics from Canada and Mexico. But on the other hand, I've heard commentators, and I'm not an expert on this, but I've heard commentators say he was played by Canada and Mexico. That in fact they did almost nothing to avoid the taxes. That Mexico already had more than 10,000 troops up on the border and didn't have to send any more troops to the border. That fentanyl coming in from Canada is a minute fraction of 1%, insignificant, and that Canada had already appropriated the $1 billion plus to bolster the border. So, the analysts who analyze these kinds of things said Trump got nothing more than symbolic victories here, not much in the way of real victories. But on the other hand, I agree with you. The pressure power, the bullying power of the United States can be used as a club to bend other nations to Trump's will. The problem for Trump is the devil is always in the details, and Trump never looks at the details.
At the beginning, we spoke about how your predictions for the US election, on reflection, disinformation was actually a big factor there. Now, looking towards future elections, are you planning on amending your system to predict elections to encompass that factor around disinformation, misinformation?
I'm definitely reevaluating my keys. Hopefully, I'll be around to make predictions in 2028 when I'll be 81 years old, or maybe I'll pass it on to my son or, someone younger and sharper. But I'm definitely reevaluating the keys, and I said that right away. I've been attacked. You're wrong, Lichtman. I admitted I was wrong immediately, right after the election. In fact, I was the first one on my live show on that Tuesday to call the election for Trump, way ahead of the media. So I wasn't concealing or hiding anything. And those people who are criticizing me for being wrong, don't recognize that that's something I admitted. You're not, telling me something new. So I am reevaluating. I'm not sure that, I've had an amazing track record with the keys, over 40 years. And as I've said many times, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not psychic Gene Dixon. I'm not Speaker Mike Johnson, who claims the Almighty talks to him. The keys are based on history, and the patterns of history can change, especially after more than 40 years. So absolutely, I am reevaluating the keys in light of the new era of disinformation. And I've gotten a lot of helpful emails from people who follow my live show. I have a live show. I discuss all these issues with my son every Tuesday and Thursday at 9 p.m. U.S. Eastern. I guess that's wee hours of the morning in the U.K. At Allan Lichtman YouTube. And a lot of our audience has sent me a lot of helpful suggestions. But I've got almost 4 years to do this.
Allan, thank you so much for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Thank you.